That's what I'm talking about.
Wait! Okay, now, from the beginning.
Welcome to BS, Beyond Stereotypes, a podcast about lawyers using their authentic voices to change the world.
When you say this is my generation, you're saying I have a perspective from whatever age I was when the pandemic happened. But there's a set of people who I don't even really know how they experienced it as a child, or people who might have been a little bit older. And so that even within your own generation, you have to be, there's a diversity within that generation.
Exactly.
And very often there's an overlap between one generation and the other that is really that nexus. Someone who said, hey, listen, I'm young enough to, I'm old enough to remember the boomer generation and the values of it, but I'm also young enough to have a real connection with the next generation. I don't think we utilize those people who are the connectors of those experiences, and we sort of we build our camps in those places that we battle rather than looking for the bridges that are connected. And I think that's where, for me, teaching is the place to do that. I have to create. I can't make it a battle between what I know and what you know.
Welcome to BS, Beyond Stereotypes. I'm your host, Merle Vaughn. Here to BS with me today is my friend, Richard Gray, whose story I find fascinating and who will no doubt inspire all of you to embrace your authenticity. Hey, Rich, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Merle. It's great to see you virtually again.
It's always great to be seen, my brother.
Yeah, no doubt.
So just for our audience's edification, I have to admit that Rich and I have been friends for a long time. We attended law school together, although since we graduated, we've been on opposite coasts, so we haven't really seen each other except for virtually. So at some point we'll have to rectify that. But today, I'm happy to have you audio only. And so thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Cool. So let me tell folks a little bit about you. I don't go into great detail because I feel like these days of the internet, you can Google just about everybody and find out more than you even want to know. But I will let people know that Rich received his JD from the University of California, Berkeley, and we were there together, and your BA from Brown University. You are the Deputy Executive Director at the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools at New York University Metro Center, where you provide support and strategic assistance to the Metro Center's community organizing, engagement, and school transformation programs. That's a lot to unpack, and hopefully we'll be able to do that because I have no idea what the hell that means. Richard is also a lecturer at Columbia Law School, helping students apply their legal training to advance authentic collaboration between educational institutions and communities. And before that, you were at New York office for Brown University's Annenberg School of Reform and director of the Institute's community organizing and engagement. And you did a lot of things related to child advocacy and access to quality public education. What did I leave out?
No, I think you hit it all. I mean, you see that my route out of law school really delved into education and exploring the role that I could play in helping to lift up voices of communities, parents and young people to impact the education system. And so I think you captured it all. And you can see that I bounced around from different universities. In fact, if you look at my resume, you'll see different universities. It looks like I moved, but we get kicked out of universities every 10 years or so. In part because I think, with the universities, while they like the work, the relationship often between those universities and communities is a tortured one. And so when we work with communities, it is sort of sometimes it's a schizophrenic relationship that those universities have with the community, sometimes supporting them, but sometimes they're exploitative relationships. And I think when we lean to support communities, sometimes universities kick us out into the community.
Got it. And all of that really supports kind of why I wanted to have this conversation with you, especially right now, because there's so much going on in our country right now with respect to education and what should be taught and what shouldn't, who should be taught it and who shouldn't, who should have access to certain things, and also the whole idea of DEI at the university level, and how that is going or not going. I understand that you are at a university, so I will not ask you to say anything that could get you canceled. I'm not trying to get you kicked out of your job, so please don't.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, please don't share anything that could jeopardize your situation. So I'll say that up front. But thank you.
Well, I'll say this, Merle. If I was worried about that, I probably would have been kicked out of the universities before. So, you reach a certain age that you want to say what you want to say. And
exactly. Thank you.
Know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And I think my listeners know that I know exactly what you mean. Which is, the whole idea of authenticity and, figuring out who you are and being, committed to being authentically you, and finding a way to be successful being authentically you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the path for me has been really trying to figure out what that authentic me is. And I went into law school with a very narrow vision of what being a lawyer could be. And when I discovered that's not what I wanted to do, I've really been on almost a 40-year odyssey to try to figure out what is it that I was really looking for when I entered law school. And I think each of my steps has sort of given me an answer to that question that really is never going to be answered, because I'm always learning and discovering a new way to be able to be in the world authentically.
Okay, so before I get into, we start really get into that, I have two things. One is we did not graduate from law school 40 years ago, y'all. So don't, he said that, but he was definitely rounding up. But the other thing is I always start out by asking the guests to share their story. And you can start with where you were born, where you're from. I'm really, interested in knowing who supported you on your journey, through your education process, through your life, what kind of struggles or you may or may not have had. And who was instrumental in, getting you to where you are.
I think the main person or people for me is, and we always start with sort of your family. I probably went into law in part because my father was a police officer, but I hated guns, so I had to figure out a different way to be engaged with the law. And so I started off very early on wanting to just fascinated by the law and the way that it operated. And at the time we were growing up, it was, you're thinking sort of the 60s, early 70s, the lawyers were on the vanguard of pushing, the civil rights agenda. And so, I had a very, very, that shaped my vision. Then my mother was an educator. My mother was a lifelong teacher, which is probably how I ended up in education. And her commitment to not only to young people, but to educators, and commitment to building a connection between education and the betterment of our family, of our people. And so I think those are really core values that I brought with me and thought that's what I wanted to do as a lawyer, to be that kind of change agent.
Nice. And so, I take it that you're the first lawyer in your family?
Yes, I am. Which is why every time I go, you would go home and, you're Richard, you're a lawyer. Say something, lawyer. That's one of those things. You're one of those people, or somebody will come up to you and they have this really complex tax issue, and like, listen, I went to law school, but I can't help you with your taxes, kind of thing. So it was that sort of first time thing, but it was also a really very proud moment for me to be able to my family had really worked for me to have that opportunity, and I felt an obligation to try to not only fulfill it in a way that would make them proud, but also in a way that was sort of figure out what my purpose is in the world. And I was taught that you live in this life. I come from folks who come from sort of a very spiritual background, and so you don't just live your life; you're living a life for purpose. And so this felt like it was helping me to figure out what that purpose would be.
So you graduate from law school, and I believe did you even summer at a law firm? Did you decide really early you were not gonna take that route?
Yeah, that was the first transformation. And it's funny, well, you're with people, and I'm not even sure I talked with a lot of my classmates about the transformation that happened for me in law school. I went to law. I decided I wanted to be a lawyer when I was 5.
Mm.
And not only did I want to be a lawyer, I wanted to be a lawyer that worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
When you were 5?
When I was 5 years old. It was back at that time where it's like, the attitude was you're either part of the solution, part of the problem. And it really went down to kids. Like, you felt like I needed to make a decision about how I was going to be a part of this. And that was my clear vision through my first year in law school. And I actually wrote to Deval Patrick, former governor. He was, at the time, he was the head of the death penalty docket at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He was also the head of the intern program. Essentially said, listen, man, I've been wanting to work with you all since I was 5. Just let a brother work there for a summer. And so the summer of 86, I worked in New York City, my first time living in New York City, worked with some greats. I worked with, Julius Chambers and all these range of giants. And it was really a wonderful experience. And I realized I didn't really want to work there. Like, my vision of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was sort of locked into a 5-year-old in the 1960s. And it was the 80s, in the middle of the Reagan administration. I actually think it was the first time that some of their clients in the death penalty docket had actually started to be executed. It was a very different place. And I was like, I'm not sure I really want to be here. Mm-hmm. And since I didn't go to law school to be a lawyer, I went to law school to work for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I was like, what the hell am I doing in law school? I went and had a conversation with my mother about it. And my mother said to me, and I'll never forget it, she said, I don't think you should leave law school. Which was mother for, you're not leaving law school. There's no way in hell you're leaving law school, you're going back. And so when I went back with a very different perspective, that I wasn't going back to be a lawyer. I was going to study the law. And so I started taking all these courses. I took, I don't know if you took the Race, Racism, and American Law class with Herbert Aptheker, right? I started taking these courses that were of interest to me rather than those that were going to lead me in a path towards being a lawyer. And then I started taking, what I really loved about Berkeley is they allowed you to take up to a third of your credits in the law school and graduate level in any other school in
really? I didn't know that.
So, yeah. And so I started taking a bunch of education courses, such an urban education course. And I really got into it. And, this is the time when A Nation at Risk was out. And so it was this whole thing where they were talking about the nation's at risk because of the education system. And so it just felt like the right place for me. But to your point, I said, I am in law school. Let me just give a taste. So I actually summer interned at Austin and Byrd.
Okay.
In my end of my second year. And it confirmed 2 things. Number one, I made more money than I had made in my entire life in that summer.
Right.
And number 2, it confirmed that I don't want to be in a place like this. Like I'm not driven. I realize why you have to pay people a lot of money to do those jobs, because there's a part of the investment that you have to make that isn't, at least for me, wasn't in the work. And I just realized that was not the place for me. And so I knew I was not going to take a traditional job.
It's interesting that you say that, because I didn't go to law school to be a lawyer either. I just wanted a graduate degree because both of my parents had graduate degrees, and I felt like, I needed one. And I thought about getting an MBA, but I already had undergraduate business degree, and Jeff, my husband, had already gone to law school, and he said, "Oh, you should go to law school." So I went to law school, and I actually tell people, so this is a great conversation to have, because as a as a recruiter, a lot of times people will ask me before they go to law school, should I go? And I say, go if you want to be a lawyer. Don't go if you don't want to be a lawyer. But you had a different experience because you figured out that you could take different classes and stuff like that. I didn't. I ended up doing a whole semester as an intern for a judge because I didn't really
Wow.
want to take those classes. So I interned for the Ninth Circuit for a semester. Um,
Oh,
yeah, so I figured out, how to get out of it too. But but I mean, I think that it just shows you that there are really options and different paths and different, ways of doing things, if you explore them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of the challenge, I really appreciate the framing of your podcast, stereotypes. And there's a stereotype of what it means to be a lawyer,
Yeah.
and that you go into with this vision of lawyers are this, lawyers are that. And what you don't realize is the range of possibilities that exist when, and for me, I realized, so reflecting back, I was still becoming a lawyer. I just wasn't becoming that narrow image of what I thought a lawyer was and should be. And so it really helped me to sort of figure out what I wanted to do, the next step. And one of the other things it did for me, and this is part of a lesson that I learned for life, I realized that, so many people were coming out and you're sort of defined by the job you take. Did you go to a big law firm? Did you go here? Did you go there? And I began to realize that was just a definition for a short part of your life. That was just for a short part of your life, that I didn't have to, like I did when I was 5. I didn't have to make a decision about what I was going to do for the rest of my life. I just had to make a decision on what I was going to do for the next part of my life. Right? And so that really, it sort of took a burden off of me, that my choices for jobs had to be defined along a different path. I could go into a path, and if I needed to change it based on what I wanted to do or wanted to learn, I could do that. And so it was a really very liberating time for me at law school to sort of decouple. And in fact, the interesting thing, Merle, I swore to all that was holy that I would never step foot in the law school again after I left.
Really?
I've been teaching for 5 years there, and so it is. So never say never. One thing, and the other thing is that it really, in some ways, it was really a route back. These less than 40 years, it have been a route back to a better understanding of why I went to law school in the first place. And I have to say, my engagement with the students has really helped me in figuring that out in a very unique way.
It's funny you say the never say never, because before I went to law school, I don't know if you know, but I was a successful salesperson. I sold computers. I was the only Black outside salesperson for Texas Instruments, and was top salesperson and all that stuff. And it was a commission job. And I swore that I would never take a substantial commission job again. It was just too much pressure. I didn't want to do that. I was never going to do it again. And then, years later, after practicing, I become a legal recruiter, which is a commission sales job. And I've been doing it for over 20 years, longer than I did anything else. So yeah, I agree that you should never say never. Or if you do say never, it's probably going to happen.
Yeah, right. And what you're really saying, for me, and speaking for myself, what I was really saying is I'm never going to do that again. Not never law school. I made it. I never wanted to be in a law school the same way that I was before. And so my entry back into law school, and I think my first job coming out of law school was really, it's kind of a funny story how I got my first job, because I was coming home for the winter break. I used to fly into Boston. I have a cousin who lives in Massachusetts, and we would drive from there to. I would hang out with him for a few days, and then we would drive to Jersey to celebrate the holidays. And he was telling me, so I was talking with this person that I'm on a board with the American Foreign Service Committee, and she needs a person for this job. And she was describing the person, and it sounded exactly like you. But I said, you're in law school, and you wouldn't want to take the job. I said, well, I was taking a class in education, and I would love to talk with them. I had actually read some of their books. It was a group organization called the National Coalition of Advocates for Students. So yeah, I would love just to maybe go in and talk with her, just to learn more about what work they're doing. And so I went in and had a really great conversation with her and a few of the staff. And by the time I got to New Jersey, my mother said, you got a call from this organization and they offered you a job.
Wow.
And I was like, I didn't realize I was in an interview. Like I was not interviewing for the job. Well, I said, well, and again, I had this job offer when I came home, and I talked to my mom and said, Mom, I got this job offer. And this was the winter of our, I think it was our second year, no, our third year in law school. So this was the middle of our third year.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, no, it was the middle of our second year. And I think it's really important, the middle of my second year. And so I said, Mom, I'm really thinking about maybe leaving law school and taking this job. And again, she said, I don't think you should do that, which meant I wasn't doing it. And if you knew my mother, the way she said it was very clear. And so I didn't. But, it was different also going back to law school, where I wasn't now also going back to having to study to be a lawyer, but I also already had a job. Like
right.
In the middle of and they actually said to me, I said, listen, I can't take the job. They said, we'll hold it for you until you finish law school.
Wow.
Which was deep to me.
Yeah.
But it was also liberating. Like, I don't have to worry about a job. And I knew that. And coming in back to law school, now not only was I free of studying the law to be a lawyer, and I'll let you know, there's a third chapter to that conversation with my mom that's coming up. I also didn't have to worry about a job, and so it allowed me to really even more freely. I took more courses in education. I began to think more about policy, and it was really fascinating coming out of law school and really going into an area where my identity within that organization was not that of a lawyer. It was that of someone who had some capacity to help run a program that was about thinking about a diverse elementary school. What are the elements? What are the necessary elements to create an elementary school that would both be diverse, inclusive, equitable? And
did you take the bar? Did you take a bar?
And people are going to think that you're setting me up. That was the third leg from my mother. I'm like, Mom, I got this great job. And she asked me, are you taking the bar? And I said, no, Mom. And I don't really think there's a need for them. It's in Massachusetts. I don't think there's really a need. And I actually been out working for 2 years already. And I said, Mom, I've been away from it. I get to study, and now I'd have to study while I'm working. And she said, I really think you should take the bar, which was, again, it's like, that was, it sounds like it's a suggestion, but she was like, you got to take the bar.
Right. Well, good for your mother. So let's move forward. You said something earlier about your father being a police officer, and I wrote down the word defund. And so I want to get your perspective on, this whole idea of defund the police, and your thoughts on that, and what you think about where we are now with law enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And, growing up as the son of a Black police officer, you understand that something like defund the police it's a slogan, right? It wasn't meant to be a policy statement, but embedded in it is this notion that we invest a lot of resources in the police that we don't really know and we don't really understand. And we often send police officers to situations where you don't really need an armed response, but yet we sort of default to doing that, where maybe if we were to defund that role for them and invest in people who have more experience in dealing with people with mental illnesses, that there would be a better engagement. So the defund for me always meant that we needed to think about how we're funding and where we're funding and how we're funding the police, and think about, maybe is this the best way to respond to the issues or needs that are in community. And I think that's a more of a range. But I will tell you this with the defund the police. When you get the talk, I got the talk when I was part of from my father. You know, I don't know, for folks who may not know the talk, it's the talk that just about every Black child, particularly a Black male child, gets from their parents about what to do when you interact with the police. And since I had both a father who was a police officer and an uncle who was a state trooper, I got the some almost like the instructor's edition of that, like these extra instructions on how to deal with the police. Like one of them was, the police can pull you over for anything, but they can't give you a ticket for anything. If you swerve too close to a line, they can pull you over for reckless driving. If you give somebody the finger, I can pull you over for a illegal hand signal, right? Just something that is, you know, they can pull anything out. And he said, Richard, when they do that, they pull you over, but then they're starting to fish when they're with you, right? They know that they're not going to be able to give you a ticket for this or that, but what they're going to do is they're going to try to goad you into doing something that will allow them to go more. So he said, the next thing they do, they will ask you perhaps the dumbest question that is humanly possible to get you to react and say it's the dumbest question. And your attitude then becomes a reason for them to be able to do more. So he said, Richard, whenever they ask you a question, answer it like, you know, it was your mother asking the question. Answer it honestly, answer it calmly. He said, if that doesn't work, put your hands on the wheels at 10 and 2 and just keep repeating over, give me a ticket or let me go. Give me a ticket or let me go. And he said, sometimes that'll get you past it. The person knows you're not going to give them any more ammunition to be able to go. And I've had to use each of those levels at one time. And the thing that they said, yeah, absolutely. And the thing they said to me that really drove it home, they said, well, you're telling me all this. And I said, you know, is this stuff that I really need to know? And they said, not only do you need to know it, I still need to know it, because when I'm not in uniform, I got to use these rules. And so there's a part of to me, of us dealing with policing that really is less about what the police do, what the police say, and it really is more about the culture of the police. And they've told me that until the culture of the police changes, that the police aren't going to change. And so my work in this, and you know, we've done some of this tangentially, and interesting, there's a nexus between this issue in the community and in schools. I've done a lot of work around police in schools. It's this whole idea of what does it mean to be a police in a community or in a school? Is it punitive, or is it supposed to be restorative? And so it's been a really interesting conversation to look at what's a different way of thinking about that. And it's almost a nexus in some ways, and I hadn't really thought about it, between my father as law enforcement and my mother as teaching. Like, what is the role where we begin to think about people being in our community, not just to sort of engage us when we're doing wrong, but to put us on a path of restoration and to be a part of that process. And I think it's really been an interesting conversation, both in schools and in communities, about that.
Oh, I'm glad I could help you make that nexus. This Rich. It's fascinating. You know, so while you were talking about that, I wrote down a couple of other words that I feel like have been like misunderstood, and that I think you probably have something to share with us about. The first one is the term woke. You know, talk to me about that, because I used to use it all the time. Hashtag, well, I mean, it was like stay woke, which was basically, to me, be aware. Don't forget about your surroundings. Don't forget who you are, you know, and it's turned into something that is totally different from that. And, you know, what's your perspective on how it's being used now?
Well, you know, it's fascinating. I do think that there's a shelf life for words, that every so often we have to re-engage with what you just did. Where does this word come from, and is it really in the same place that it is now? And I think woke is one of those terms. It had a purpose. It has a history, but I think in many ways they think that the way that it's defined now is the way that it's always been. And there is this clash between, I think, those of us who know what the word means in this context, and people who, and this is maybe why I was a history major, who actually think that history started when they started remembering things.
Right.
There isn't a context for it. And so that's why I think periodically there needs to be this thing. You know where I learned this, and this is going to be fascinating. I don't remember the name of the professor at Berkeley. I couldn't stand him personally, but he was a really good teacher, which is it's sort of a paradox I've been trying to grapple with for my whole life. But he used to do this thing where it was a torts teacher, and he would take the black letter law definition, and then he would do a history of cases for each of the words in the black letter law. So that by the end of the semester, when you read that black letter law, you had a history of cases and decisions and thinking for each of those words, and you looked at it. And so I now use a definition, like when I go into conversations about woke, I'll start with, well, here's what the definition was. And so that people are sort of grounded in something, and then saying, here's the definition. So how has the history of how we've used it changed the words in this particular thing? And people begin to realize that there's a history to this word, there are connections to this word that other people have, so that we can now have hopefully at least a common, at least in this group, a common understanding of what we're talking about, rather than thinking that we're talking about the same thing, but actually we're talking about two different things. So we're really arguing about a misunderstanding or a misconnection rather than the real point of what's happening in the world.
Well, and even further than that, it's being weaponized against the people who actually, coined it in the first place for a totally different reason.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. You mentioned my first experience with this was the word at risk, which is now, if you talk about it, at-risk youth, it's actually considered an archaic and sometimes even a negative term to use. When I first started doing the work, I was a part of my organization, NCAS, was a part of a group that actually coined that phrase, at-risk students, because it was a response to a nation at risk that was saying that the nation was at risk because of the school system, and essentially they were saying because of the kids and communities in it. And what we were saying is, no, these students are at risk from the kind of system that we're creating for them. Right? It was a very particular term. But over time, we began seeing that term used, in some ways co-opted by other people, which means that we then have to say, either we're going to fight for that term, or we have to say, you know what, that term's outlived its usefulness. And maybe what they're saying to us is, you got to come up with a new term, a new understanding, a new reflection. And I think we have to do that in some cases.
Well, I'll tell you the case where I think we have to do that is the term affirmative action.
Yes.
Because it's like, it started as something that was good and positive and, like you said, restorative, and it now has a totally negative connotation. So I'm like, fine, let's not use it, because any person who, because now again it's weaponized against people, and it's assumed that it coincides with unqualified, and so I'm fine with not using affirmative action. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't figure out a way to have equality and equity.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree completely. And it's funny being on, in some ways, because of my age, I'm on the edge of the beginning of things that are now, we were some on the edge of the beginning of things that are now in place. So I wasn't a part of the sort of the civil rights that changed the laws, but when they started to integrate people, I was one of the first, group of kids to be integrated. And very often we battle about words and terms in a political arena, but there's a reality to how integration played out that was both positive and negative, right? And so if we don't go back and say these are terms that allow, that these terms, while they define what we're doing, they're really just sort of they're a starting point for a conversation that isn't just about a definition of affirmative action, but it's about what are we trying to do? right? And
Exactly.
if we're trying to do something that affirmative action at one point in time captured what we were trying to do, but it doesn't capture it now, let's go back to what we were trying to do and come up with a new term that does. Rather than sometimes fighting for a term, rather than fighting for what the term is supposed to be about and what it's supposed to produce.
Exactly. And so that I've been writing down these terms because I need you to school me, Richard. So the next one I wrote down, is critical race theory, right? I mean, what? Talk to me about it.
Well, the funny thing is, I remember critical race theory when we were in law school, like it was a sort of an emerging term, and beginning to think about this idea and notion of how systems impact racism. And so when I started hearing it in education, my first reaction was, this has got nothing to do with education. And it became, like you said, just like woke and other, it became sort of a catchphrase that you just throw everything that you hate about diversity, inclusion, about equity, about discussing and dealing with issues of race. It became sort of a catch-all for that, right? So to the point where you would ask people, what does it mean? They couldn't tell you what it was. They just told you they didn't like it.
Right.
And so, and internally, I had the same battle about, it was a sort of a debate that existed. There are people like, we need to fight for that term because and I understand, it's like, it's a term we coined. We don't want to give it up. We don't want to. And there's a part of it where I said, yeah, we could do that. Or we could fight and some of us could be fighting for what the term was supposed to be about and say,
Exactly.
listen, race theory, I think you're going to have a hard time convincing people what it is when there's been so much, there's been such an effort to shift the narrative about what that word is. So my thing is to give that to them, and then let's talk about what we're really engaged with, and when to do that, how to do that. I think is really important. But you're right. Critical race theory is definitely one of those. And I think, to your point, we have to go back and think about a lot of those terms that we have used. We're pulling a lot of language that is older language into newer versions of a dilemma. And I think you're at a point, and you've named the point. And it's a lot of the work that I do now is, how do you create a shared language for people who might view things differently, and so that we're not relying on old language for an old context, but we're creating new language that is really a progression. It's not different. It's not saying we're getting rid of it, but there's our language reflects our struggle and movement. And so if there is movement, so does the language. The language has to move as well. And so
in law school, I have this impression that young people who go to law school these days, no matter what race they are, primarily are interested in equity and inclusion and belonging and diversity and all that stuff, and are frustrated because the people who are running things are basically idiots. And so is that am I on, is that accurate or no?
I think that's it's not only is it accurate, it actually sounds like you were listening to a conversation I was having with my son yesterday. Which is true. I mean, and I think the young people come by that characterization quite honestly, right, in what they see. I will say this: what I'm struck by with the young people is it's an opportunity. I believe, that every generation is given a set of questions that's unique to that generation.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, you begin to, when you're answering and you're dealing with the exam, you begin to say, "Damn, this is a math I've never seen before, right? This is some new analysis." And I think when you reach a certain age and that happens, and it's signaled for me that now what I need to do is to try to figure out, how do I share with the next generation what I've learned and experienced, so that they can start to answer questions that I can't answer.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I found with young people is they have that vision, just like you said, things are screwed up and we have these ideals. And my challenge to them is not to change that. It's sort of, what are you going to do? And what is your vision of what the world can and should be? And those are your sets of questions that you're going to have to answer and how to change it. That's just why I always recoil whenever I hear an elder say, well, these kids don't know real oppression. I face real
Mm-hmm.
oppression. I said, every generation has said the exact same thing. They said the
Yep.
same thing to people when they came out of slavery. What do you mean? What do you mean this is bad? Jim Crow is good. You at least want to have the slave master on us, right? Every generation, right? But this generation said that this is all I know, and this ain't right. And so there's a part of it where you have to figure out, well, how do I make sure that while you're trying to answer and deal with this, that you understand the progression of where it is and the role that history plays in this, and then how do I translate what I know into a way that they can understand it, and then more importantly, that I'm not preaching to them, I'm sharing with them and saying, listen, these are the lessons that I've learned, and you now have to figure out how to apply those lessons to this new context. And I can help you with some of it, but some of it you're going to have to do on your own, because it's, I'm Moses taking you, and now you're Joshua. You got to take it to the next level, right? This is as far as I can go. And I think that's a hard thing sometimes. I think some of us hold on to that leadership, hold on to that role of running things and answering things a little bit too long without building that kind of collaboration across generations. And being in law school, being in with the community organizing, where you go into communities that have always been told they need to do, where they need to go, to create real conversations that are driven by them in ways where you bring expertise to bear, but not to drive the conversation, but to lift up their voices and help them to push their vision. It creates a different kind of humility in the way that you engage people.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I learn a lot more there, rather than teaching a lot of people. I'm learning a lot more about how and what to do. So it's really been a fascinating journey for me.
Well, it's interesting because I agree. It's very frustrating for me when I hear people of my generation or close, up to my generation saying, these kids don't know anything, or back when in my day, or, I'm this age, and so I guess this defines why I'm doing or thinking the way I am. I can't stand that. But by the same token, when I hear younger people, fall back on here, we have these terms again, Gen, millennials and Gen X and boomers, and and like there's this huge difference between people based on that. I kind of take offense to it, because, when I think about how I think compared to a lot of people my age, I'm like, well, hell, maybe I'm really a millennial, and, so the idea that, and so I have those conversations with younger people, even in our business. Is like, look, I agree with you that things are different, but discounting or just relying totally on, well, it's totally different and you don't understand because you're a boomer, you're doing yourself a disservice, because you're not taking advantage of the experience
Right.
that I can share, or somebody, in my generation can share. I don't want to tell you how to do everything, but I also don't want you to, I want you to benefit from my mistakes.
I agree. And I think part of it, Merle, you've gone to a place that has really been an area of exploration for me, because education by definition is an intergenerational structure. You're building a relationship between someone who's younger or even less experienced in a context with someone who has experience. And one of the things that I've always felt challenged by the generations is the sort of static nature of developing them when human interaction is dynamic. I heard the greatest definition of generation was, stop this 20-year thing. Think of seminal experiences that a generation, a group of people have between the age of 13 and 18, that shapes them. I mean, how many times I remember hearing people say, where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? Or where were you when Martin Luther King was assassinated, right? And those are experiences that actually shape a generation, because everybody's dealing, with the dynamic. The pandemic is going to be
Right.
a generation shaping, right? But here's the difference, and this is the part where I felt like I learned something. I'm technically, we're technically a part of the boomer generation, although I have less in common with somebody who was born in 1946 than I do with somebody who was born in 1970, who was considered the next
Exactly.
generation, right? And
Exactly.
so, but I do have, and I think there's been something that I've been able to do, and part of my role is I have the experience of a boomer as a child. Like I remember Martin Luther King being assassinated, but I was 6, right? And so the impact on me is different than somebody who was 16, who was 26, right? But I still have that experience. And when you begin to realize millennials or any generation or any group, when you say this is my generation, you're saying I have a perspective from whatever age I was when the pandemic happened. But there's a set of people who I don't even really know how they experienced it as a child, or people who might have been a little bit older. And so that even within your own generation, you have to be, there's a diversity within that generation. And very
Exactly.
often there's an overlap between one generation and the other that is really that nexus. Someone who said, hey, listen, I'm young enough to, I'm old enough to remember the boomer generation and the values of it, but I'm also young enough to have a real connection with the next generation. I don't think we utilize those people who are the connectors of those experiences, and we sort of we build our camps in those places that we battle rather than looking for the bridges that are connected. And I think that's where, for me, teaching is the place to do that. I have to create. I can't make it a battle between what I know and what you. This something came up. I remember hearing one of my really good students. I really loved the young man, and he was describing in the 80s, like something in the 80s. This is what the 80s were like, and everything he said was accurate, and it was still wrong, right? Because he wasn't there, right? He was describing something that he heard or read, but he couldn't. There was a texture, right? It was synthetic, and rather than sort of say, "Son, you're wrong," I said, you know what? And I think this is what we need to do more of. I'm not going to tell you what the 80s were like. I'm going to tell you a story about it, right? In human form, that gives you a sense of how it wasn't just a fact or this or a condition, but people were living, and what you're explaining as being an absolute was really a question back then. Like it was grappling with it. We really didn't understand it. And I think part of what we need to do is, rather than sort of telling between the generations, this is what it was like and this is what it is, we need to start to say, here's how I lived in that particular generation. Here's what I was, here are the things we did really well. Here are the things we did really poorly. Here are the questions we answered. These are the questions that I don't really understand. And it's in that human exploration where students sort of engage with us that you begin to see, well, here's where I can pick up there. Here's where I can learn something from you. We hadn't even really thought about this. Maybe we can do a modern version of it. And I think more importantly, for an elder, I've had to learn to listen to young people in a different way. Diversity isn't just about, hey, me as a Black person being more. It also means I need to be more inclusive of Black people. Well, this is why I think we're in this day and age where we're lifting up the roles of Black women, right? Because historically, when we said Black, that was absent. So some of this really is about us naming some of the things that we did in the past, but we didn't quite complete them, and turning those over or handing those over and helping the next generation to explore them. I think we just
Amen. Amen. My brother, I could listen to you all day. I need to come sit in on a class, I feel like.
I'm gonna make that happen. Like it really is you had talked about it. I think your podcast and the work you're doing just aligns with what we're trying to do at Columbia Law School, which is really rethinking law school in a way that says, how do you prepare young people to not have being a lawyer as their identity, but as a part of their identity, so they can bring their full selves, including their legal training, into the mix, but also bringing a range of capacities that they have. And I think what you're doing, I respect this so much. I envy you, because what you're doing is a part of what I would love to do as well, and having people tell their stories. I'm so proud to know you, and I'm really, really honored that you be a part of this.
So thank you for saying that. So we're basically out of time. I usually ask people what they do for fun and all that kind of stuff. And I do follow you on Facebook, and just before we end, you all, every so often you put up a photo of you sitting on a porch, usually with a strong drink,
Yes.
and a view of maybe a church, and it's a
Mhm, mhm.
beautiful scene. And I'm going to let you take us out by explaining what that's all about.
That is my porch. And I bought a home with my cousin when my first job was in Boston, Massachusetts, and um, we couldn't buy anything in Boston. So my cousin and I said, we want to buy a house. From our family was Southern tradition. You buy land and buy property. So all of us tried to buy houses and bought houses before we were in our 20s. And so we bought a house in Wareham, which is right near Cape Cod. It's right before the Porch Bridge. And I loved it because it has this wraparound porch and there's a church right in front and there are chimes at the church. And so I just go out there very often as a place for me to reflect. I don't worry about the day in the past. It's a way to depressurize. And it's just a symbol of peace for me there. And I invite people to come onto it's like I invite you to my church, my porch church, but you gotta follow the rules. You can't talk about work out here. You can't, your drink of choice, and we're just in the moment. And I feel like I've needed that in order to sort of deal with the complexity of life. You need those moments just to be able to sort of stop and reflect. And so that's what my porch is for me.
I love that. And not only do I want to come to your class, I want to come to your porch. So we're gonna have to work that out.
Well, you always welcome. Our colleague, our classmate Jeff Kelly. Every time I post something up there, he always asks me, "Okay, what you drinking?" So I would love you. You have an open invitation
Well, thank
come.
you.
In fact, I'm to the porch, so please take me up on that. You and Jeff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, you know what? We're out of time. I really hate for this to end. I'm so glad that we had these
Yeah.
conversations and we have this synergy where storytelling matters and that you can, really connect with people and really help people understand, differences through stories. And I think what you're doing, exemplifies that.
Yeah, I would love to, first of all, just love to talk with you even on the podcast. And there's also a whole range of my life that I'm the chair of the board of the Broadway Advocacy Coalition that's been doing a lot of work on shifting the storytelling on Broadway. And I work with Karen Parsons, who's Hillary from The Fresh Prince, who's been doing this great work with her organization called Sweet Blackberry, that does the small animated films about little known stories in Black history. And so much of my life, both professional, sort of personal professional, has really been in this area of storytelling, which I think I always find fascinating, which is why I jumped at the opportunity to talk with you.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you took that leap, and I'm glad I had the sense to invite you after 3 years. But we're basically out of time. So thank you, Richard, for being here to BS with me today. And thanks to everyone for listening. Until the next episode, remember that everybody is different and different is good.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about. Wait! Okay, now, from the beginning.
We hope you enjoyed the stories shared in today's episode of BS, Beyond Stereotypes. Join us next time when another authentic personality unleashes their uniqueness on the world.